this is Maxx Payne, and you're listening to InYourHeadOnline.com. Jack and 1-inch biceps, they're the greatest. I don't care what anybody says about them. They're all right by me.
All right, and we're back, and we're joined by Maxx Payne. Welcome to In Your Head.
Hey, man, thanks for letting me be a part of your show.
Yeah, look, I've always been a big fan of yours. I'm not just saying that because you're on here, but I always liked the gimmick. I was kind of like the dark guys, and like when you were doing it, everyone wasn't doing it, so it stood out.
Yeah. Well, that was it's funny because that's what I grew up with, man. I grew up with Alice Cooper and Black Sabbath, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else because it was so much what I was. So, from the very inception of the gimmick, that was the whole deal, is playing up to the dark side because I loved that mentality. So it really wasn't a gimmick for me. It was really pretty much who I am,
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember when you first came into WCW and they talked about, like, you were a big collegiate wrestler, and I actually found out that was true. Now, when you were doing, like, when you were wrestling in college or whatever, did you want to become a professional wrestler, or did you, like, look down at professional wrestling?
It's funny you'd ask that because I actually did look down at professional wrestling. In fact, every once in a while, just to humble my dumb ass, I will pull out an article that when I was in my senior year at Iowa State, after I placed at the Nationals and was an All-American, the paper interviewed me and asked me what I was going to do. And one of the things they asked me is, well, obviously you're going to follow in the great Chris Taylor's footsteps and be a wrestler. And I said, there is no chance in hell I'll ever be a professional wrestler because that crap's all fake and blah, blah, blah. And, it's one of those things that, you find out later in life, especially in my case. I moved to Los Angeles almost immediately after I left college and found professional wrestling almost immediately. So you'd be surprised how easily you can eat your own foot, So I ate my own foot pretty quick on that one because, and the other side of it was, once I got into wrestling and pro wrestling, I found how much I loved it, and it really, like we talked about just a couple seconds ago, it allowed me to be, and I loved that. And so I could let the dark side come out. I could be the character I wanted to be. I could, evoke my dark side, if you will, and I always loved that. So, originally, I talked because in college, man, I'd walk through the airport, and because I was the biggest guy on the team, and somebody go, oh, man, you're a big dude. What do you do? And I say, as a wrestler. And they go, oh, yeah, I watch it on TV all the time. And I go, you've never watched me on television. What are you talking about? It would piss me off because there's a great pride in being an amateur wrestler, very much the same as there is being a pro wrestler. So, there was very much a stigma attached to being a pro wrestler as an amateur wrestler. But then once I got into professional wrestling and realized how incredibly difficult it was, and it really saw the art side of pro wrestling, I just loved it. It just fit into my personality so much that for me it was a very easy transition into the professional wrestling world.
How did you get involved in it at all? Even start in it if you were looking down on it? Did someone just come to you, or did you?
Yeah. When I moved to Los Angeles after I graduated from college, when I was a young man. I was in a motion picture, which actually it's pretty funny. I was just reading on the internet the other day. It's one of the greatest sports movies of all time. It was a amateur wrestling movie produced in 1978 called Takedown. And I used my real name, obviously, then, because I was a 16-year-old kid. I used my real name, which is Daryl Peterson. And, the whole movie bug bit me. And I got married at a very early age. In fact, I got married right after Takedown. I got married when I was a junior in high school and dropped out of high school. But I'd already done really well in the amateur wrestling world. So I used amateur wrestling to put myself through college. And, like I said, I swore I'd never be a professional wrestler. But when I graduated from college, I moved back to Utah, which is my home state. And I actually called the guy that was the director of photography in Takedown. His name's Reed Smoot. He's still a cinematographer and a very profound DP, director of photography. And I asked him, I said, I want to get back into the film industry. What should I do? And he said, well, if you want to be in the film industry, Daryl, you don't have a choice. You gotta move to Los Angeles. And I already knew that inherently, that Los Angeles is where I needed to be in the film, the television and film industry. And so I moved to Los Angeles. And right before I finished my wrestling career at Iowa State, a guy came through doing interviews for the NCAA, and he was a videographer he was a freelance videographer for CBS Sports, and his name was Richard Zimmerman, and he came and interviewed me. And while we were talking, when he interviewed me, I said to him, I said, I really want to do television and film. And he said, hey, if you're ever in Los Angeles, look me up. I'll give you a job. So I moved to Los Angeles to seek my profession, and I didn't have much luck. I got down there, and I was looking for a job, and I couldn't find work. And one day, my cousin won. I was living with my cousins, and he won some passes to a movie premiere. It was Big Top Pee-wee. And the movie was premiering at Mann's Chinese Theater, and it was just a typical Hollywood movie premiere. There was all kinds of stars there, James Brolin and David Lee Roth and Alice Cooper and Steve Martin, and it was just one of those big events in L.A. And I was there as just as a spectator. And while I was standing there, I was literally probably 2 or 3 days away from leaving Los Angeles because I couldn't find any work. And there was a security guard standing there, and I started, BSing with the guy, and I said, hey, how hard is it to get a job, in your company? And he gave me a card right then, and he said, dude, you'd have a job in 5 minutes because you're so big, and, the guy that owns the company loves amateur wrestlers, and because I'd already told him, what I'd done. And so I called the dude, and the guy put me to work the next day. And that weekend, the first weekend I worked for this security company, I did a boxing match at the Palladium in downtown Los Angeles, and it was Tate, Tillman, and Gonzalez. It was right after the Olympics, and there was a couple of the boxers that had won gold medals in the Olympics, and they were coming out, and for the first time professionally. And I went and I was a security guard at this fight. I was a ringside guard and a backdoor guard, which is the great jobs actually in that kind of a gimmick. Yeah. And while I was there, the owner of the company came up to me. The first thing happened was the owner of the company came up to me and says, he met me, and he was a big amateur wrestling fan. And believe it or not, the guy was actually from Utah and knew who I was. And he goes, have you ever thought about being a professional wrestler? And I said, well, not really, but he said, you got to meet this guy. And he introduced me to a guy by the name of Red Bastien. And Red was, as you guys know, he trained Sting and, the Ultimate Warrior and, just a myriad of great guys who went through the wrestling business. And I met Red, and Red said, you got to come be a wrestler. And so I met him. Then right after that, the guy I'd done an interview with at Iowa State was backing away from the ring. I didn't realize who he was backing away from the ring. I put my hand on him so he wouldn't fall. Excuse me, because I was pretty adept at television. I'd worked at a commercial television station while I was going to college for 3 years. And the guy didn't fall down. He turned around and said, thank you. And he looked at me and he goes, holy crap, Iowa State guy. And I said, yeah. I said, hey, I'm in Los Angeles. And he gave me a card, and I got a job with him almost immediately. I met Red Bastien that day, and on the same day, I was standing at the back door of the theater, and Farrah Fawcett and what was his name? He was married to Ryan O'Neal. She was married to Ryan O'Neal at the time, and they come running out the back door to get out before the crowd left, and she wasn't paying attention, and she wasn't watching. She was running really fast and had her back to me, and she turned, and her face buried right in my chest, and she looked up at me and went, oh, excuse me. And so that was my claim to fame. That was a big day in my life. I met Red. I got a really good job as a videographer on that day, and I met Farrah Fawcett and Ryan O'Neal that day. So, it's one of those things you just don't forget. Right. But that's how I got in the wrestling business.
When you got in, when you your training stuff, did any of the guys try to stretch you or anything, or did they have more respect for you because you were coming from the college background?
You know, it's funny you'd ask me that because most guys in the wrestling business have a lot of respect for collegiate wrestlers because most of them don't have that background. And guys who do have that background, as you know, they're the guys who, you know, in the wrestling business, you know, they are afraid of being stretched. You know what I mean? They don't want a guy that knows how to shoot, you know, messing around with them. So, you know, that happened to me a couple of times. Guys tried to take the piss out of me. And when they did, you know, I would immediately switch to amateur wrestling and just stop them. But one night I was working, actually right after that, one of the things Red did for me that was really cool is, at the time, Red was a ring agent for the WWF in Los Angeles and most of the West Coast. And so Red gave me a job in the WWF, building the ring and hauling jackets back and forth. And Red told me, he said, don't ever come to the arena without your gear. So I already had equipment. I already bought my B-Bar 8 boots, and, you know, I had my K&H tights. And one night, Jay Strongbow came back to the dressing room, and he said to me, he says, Max, he says, listen, there's a football player here from the San Diego Chargers, and he wants to be a wrestler, and he said, I need you to just stretch the shit out of him. And I said, wow, I never done that. And he said, I don't care. He said, I want you to get in the ring and just beat the crap out of him. And so after the matches were over that night, they locked all the doors of the arena, and we hadn't started tearing the ring down yet. And I put my boots on and my wrestling gear, and I got in the ring with this guy. And right when I got in the ring with this guy and tied up with him, he goes, man, I don't know a damn thing about wrestling. Go easy on me. And I just beat the piss out of it. And the guy never got in the wrestling business consequently from that.
Right.
So, you know, it was one of those things where, you know, there were a few times guys challenged me, but for the most part, you know, I quickly realized that the wrestling business was, you know, it's a different mentality. And, you know, it's such an art form. I have to tell you, even today, I respect the art form. In fact, I think that's one of the biggest problems in the wrestling business. I think the art form seems to be fleeting, but I always respected it. So, you know, most guys, they didn't piss around with me very much because, you know, they knew my potential. Then on top of that, you know, I went to Japan and trained with Fujiwara and Maeda, Takada. You know, I broke into the wrestling business with New Japan Pro Wrestling, excuse me, at a time when actually most people don't know this, but the UWF was one of the first supposed legitimate shoot organizations. You know, it's kind of the beginning of the sort of, you know, full contact ultimate fighting thing that's going on now. Mm-hmm. And these guys were kind of the groundbreakers for that. And so I was trained by some of the guys who had been trained by Carl Gotch and, you know, the old-timers. So I learned submission wrestling on top of my amateur wrestling. So most people were just scared shitless I was going to hurt them. So almost all of them were very good about, you know, not trying to do that. And I never did that unless somebody pushed me. And I can honestly say, with the exception of a couple of times, most of which was never in the ring, I never had to deal with that.
Yeah. We got a few callers here that have been on hold for a little bit. Let's get to them quick. We got Joel from Portugal.
João, yes.
Joel, sorry.
How are you doing, Mr. Maxx Payne?
How you doing, man?
I'm doing fine. I have two quick questions because I know a lot of people are in the queue waiting to get a question for you as well. My first question is, you had worked a couple of years ago for WCW, and when you started working for them, you worked started working in the era of Cowboy Bill Watts. And you stay there until the era of Eric Bischoff. What do you say would be the differences between those two eras?
Well, I think first of all, I think Bill Watts was much more. Bill Watts was much more a guy who was into the fundamentals of wrestling. And I got to tell you one thing I really loved about Bill Watts. First of all, he was a huge fan of guys that were amateur wrestlers. You know, he loved Doc, and, you know, anybody that had the amateur wrestling background, he loved them. And that's one of the biggest reasons he brought me on, because, you know, I had a shooter background, and guys like Bill Watts believed that amateur wrestlers added credibility to the business.
And I don't think he was wrong for that. But Bill was a guy who really liked to plan. And one of the big problems I had in WCW is they just did not know what to do with a freak like me. You know, here I am, a guy who was a shooter, who, you know, they believed would, you know, could handle himself as a wrestler, but then add the guitar gimmick and the dark thing, and it was really, you know, it was something even Bill Watts wasn't familiar with. But Bill knew that they needed a plan for me. And I think that was one of the biggest problems I had in the WCW initially was they just did not know how to deal with me, especially after the first night they put me in the ring and put me in front of people. They asked me to play the national anthem, and people didn't want to boo me because I played the national anthem legitimately.
Right.
They wanted to cheer.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't want to treat me like a heel. They wanted to treat me like a babyface because, shit, I just played the national anthem for them, you know? So there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion with Bill. I think if Bill would have stuck around, he would have seen the true light that I brought to the table. Eric was much more enamored by the big boys, Hogan, all the guys at the top who'd been around, and Eric wanted to perpetuate the guys who were already on top rather than building, you know, new young guys and new potential characters. And then I had a couple run-ins with Eric, especially the deal I had with the Nasty Boys, and that soured Eric on me quite wholeheartedly. And Eric just really never liked me. So that was my big problem.
Yeah. Just quickly, you're saying about, like, you know, Watts wasn't sure what to do with you and stuff. Do you ever think that sometimes, like, bringing up that you were, like, an amateur wrestler kind of went against, like, your character? Like, it really didn't fit with your guy, like, you know, like the persona you were, like, portraying on TV?
Well, I think only because they didn't exploit it. You know what I mean? I don't think it would have gone against my character at all because I was, you know, everybody thought of me as a big badass. You know what I mean?
Right.
How does that go against a guy who's dark? You know what I mean? I don't need to. There's no gimmick involved in me kicking your ass. I can do it legitimately.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I don't think I think that was part of the thing. How do we exploit that? I was really a contradiction of terms for them. You know, I mean, and then on top of that, I was a legitimate guitar player, which just really never happened in the wrestling business. You know, so I mean, I was a legit wrestler, a legit musician, and legit guys in the wrestling business. Well, that just doesn't really fit, does it?
Right. What was the other question?
So,
the other question is, you also work for the WWFE now. You worked back in the mid-90s, and
yes.
We know now, because of the documentaries and all the history, you know, from back in the day of the drugs that were, you know, in the locker rooms, all the problems with drugs. You yourself had a run-in with drugs. So in a nutshell, my question is, was the problem with drugs a serious problem in the WWF back in the days, in the locker rooms within the wrestlers?
You know, one of the things you have to remember about the wrestling business, and I've said this over and over in interviews, and I'll say it again, is one of the biggest problems wrestlers face is they live the ultimate dichotomy. They live a business where they get their asses kicked on a daily basis. They're always tore up. We work 340 days a year out of a 365-day year, you know, a 365-day year. And so it's one of those, it's not just that you need pain pills. It's not just that you need steroids to recover. It's the fact that on top of that, people don't think you're legit. They don't realize how tough the wrestling business is. And so it's easy as a wrestler to, first of all, it's easy to get drugs, pain drugs, because they're so readily available. You walk into a doctor, and if he follows his Hippocratic oath and he takes one look at you, you know, how beat up you are, he's going to give you anything you want, whether you're a guy that's trying to, you know, whether you're one of the guys that are the questionable doctors or whether you're a completely legit doctor. My hometown doctor in Pleasant Grove, Utah, would give me anything I want because every time I come home, I couldn't walk, I couldn't lift my shoulders, my neck was tore up, my shoulders were tore up. So drugs are always going to be a problem in the wrestling business because the one thing in the wrestling business is it is a life of pain. And I love to quote Jesse Ventura whenever somebody asks me this question. Jesse said in a Penthouse interview in the mid-'80s, he said, "I never left the ring that I wasn't in pain."
And people can never forget that. Wrestlers are in pain. It is a tough, tough job. They're in pain both physically is actually probably the easy side to deal with when you consider you're dealing with a business that has 65 guys really making money. You're dealing with the psychological side of the business, which is trying to scratch and fight your way to the top of a business where, there's only 65 guys making money, if you're lucky. You know what I mean? It's not like football where there's, in pro football there's 1,500 players that can actually make a living doing it, or basketball where there's, another 1,500 guys that can be at the top in the wrestling business. If you're lucky on any given day, there's 40 guys in the wrestling business that are making legitimate money. So it's a very intense mental pain job, too, plus you're traveling like crazy and everything else. So I'm very understanding about wrestlers and drugs, and I understand why that happens, and I have a completely different opinion about steroids, too, and I'm sure that question will come up later, and I'll love to address it, but I think that's one of the things that, as a wrestler, I think everybody goes through a period of, the guys that are still alive learned how to cope with the pain. They learn how to get through on a daily basis. Some guys just, medicate themselves, self-medicate to the point where they get so numb they don't realize what they're doing, and that's why we've lost so many great wrestlers to drugs.
Thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
Yep.
I hope that answered your question, brother.
Oh, I think so. Along those, how are you doing, like health-wise, injury-wise?
Well, it's funny you'd ask me that because, I was an amateur wrestler for 13 years before I was a professional wrestler, and about 10 years ago, I went to a reunion alumni match with my amateur wrestling team from junior college, and all my friends in junior college are just physically torn up really bad because amateur wrestling is just really tough on your body. And all my friends said to me then, how in the hell did you go on and do the professional wrestling business? And, I have to ask myself that sometimes, but surprisingly enough, right now, I live a life of pain. That's just part of the deal. But I'm not too bad. I'm still walking. I'm still shuffling around. My shoulders are in pretty good shape still. My back's not bad. So as of right now, I'm still Homo sapien. By, the end of the next 10 years, I might be, bent over to Neanderthal. Who knows?
I know some of our guests have said, they thought it was like a myth that, when you take time off that your injuries heal, and some of them said they've actually gotten worse, over time. Did you feel like your stuff got somewhat better after you, left, stopped taking bumps, or how have they gotten worse?
Oh, yeah. Well, for me, because I quit so wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And I actually got out before I had, a completely severely debilitating injury. I was pretty lucky. I had some pretty bad injuries in the wrestling business. I had a dual inguinal hernia surgery tear, and, I started getting tore up. And so it was time for me, to move on and to greener pastures, if you will. But the wrestling business, man, I don't care. Look at Terry Funk, for God's sakes, man. Those old-timers that are still around. And look at Mick. Those guys they're just tore to bits, man. And, you're going to pay for that your whole life. And there's no way around it. So, to answer your question honestly, yeah, I wake up every day. And, I remember the bump I took in Cornicoin Hall and in Japan where I went over the ring and blasted my knee. I remember the bump I feel my shoulder every day where I took a bad bump in the Coliseum in Memphis and tore my shoulder to bits not once but twice. And then the other thing is you got to remember too about wrestlers. If you think there's any such thing as rehabilitation or physical therapy, it just doesn't exist. Most wrestlers, you learn to work through the pain. And the mantra of wrestlers is it's a long way from your heart, kid. So.
Mm-hmm. We got Adam on the line.
Yeah, I got two questions. I read on the internet that you appeared or did something with Wrestlemania 2. How was that like?
What they did at Wrestlemania 2, Jess, I certainly didn't do much at Wrestlemania 2. What I did do is I built the cage for Hogan and Bundy in California. That's what my job. I was still working as part of the ring crew in California, and so I built the cage for Hogan and Bundy,
And I got to tell you, it was one of the most exciting moments of my life. It was a blast. And I had a nephew that was actually in the wrestling business. His name was Scott Peterson. He's deceased now, God rest his soul. But he actually ended up being part of the wrestling business too. He worked with a guy named Steve Dollop in the Portland territories for a long time, and then unfortunately lost his life in a car accident. But we worked together when I lived in Los Angeles and building the ring and building the cage for the Wrestlemania series, Wrestlemania 2 series. So it was spectacular. It was a great time, and just really a lot of fun, and something I would never forget.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and my second question is, do you see yourself as a WWE Hall of Famer?
You know, I would have to say no on that. You know, my career is the WWF when I was there. They pulled me so far away from the dark, and pulled me so far away from the Maxx Payne gimmick. Vince just didn't want me to be. You know, by the time I got to the WWF at the time, you know, basically everybody was doing dark. By then it was Sting, NWO. You know, now it was just a guy, you know, not a cutting edge guy anymore. I almost looked like a wannabe, which is unfortunate because I actually was one of those guys who really was one of the leaders in the dark side. But you know, the truth of the matter is I didn't like the gimmick I portrayed in the WWF at the time. It really took me away from what I really was. I think, like, once again, I think I was, and I'm certainly not blaming Vince for this. I take a lot of responsibility. They didn't really know what to do with me either. I was a pain in the ass at the time. My ego was running out of control. And the Man Mountain Rock character just didn't fit me, and I didn't do anything spectacular in the WWF to remember, you know, to speak of. So to say I'm a Hall of Famer in the WWF, I'd have to answer the truth of the matter is probably not.
Oh, all right.
Did you ever speak up to, like, try to change your character, or did you just kind of go with the character they gave you?
You know, I did, and they just, you know, Vince is very headstrong about, you know, giving you your character, and a lot of it has to do with ownership. And you know, I didn't like the character, and I tried to change it. I really just didn't like it. It just didn't fit me, and I tried to speak up, but more than that, I just internalized it. The other side of it is, we had a lot of things going on behind the scenes during that time. You know, I was supposed to. The lead singer of my band was there. We were supposed to do a band thing. We were going to come out and, you know, be basically, my goal was eventually to be sort of a house band for the WWE. And it just never came to fruition because of all the problems I had behind the scene, not only myself and the Road Dogg and the other people I was working with. And so, you know, it just I tried, but, you know, and then on top of that, by that time, you know, I had children. I had 4 children that I was raising, and my children really needed their father to be at home at that time, and I had to make a decision. Do I want to know my kids? Do I want my kids to know who I was? And I made a decision at that time in my life to stay home and raise my children. So I made a priority decision in my life that, you know what, I wasn't going to let my kids go through high school and not know who their father was, and so I stayed home and raised my kids.
Mm-hmm. When you said you had problems backstage, was it with the Road Dogg, or like they had problems with you and like the Road Dogg in these days?
Well, Road Dogg went there. We both went there with a plan in mind, and the plan was, if you look back at what was going on at that time, the plan was that Road Dogg and I were going to end up together and play a bunch of original music and release an album and do some stuff together at the time. And eventually, I am going to release the album. In fact, I still have all the master tapes, and I think the time has come for me to actually try and get the damn thing mixed down and release it, because it's still surprisingly some very amazing music. And Brian is one incredible singer. I've always believed Brian's just got an amazing voice, and I've never believed he's capitalized on his vocal talents the way he could have, because most people don't know how really great Brian James can sing. The guy has got a gift from hell. He's just one of the most vocally gifted men I've ever met in my life. But, you know, I just, behind the scenes, you know, Brian, we went up there, and he fell apart personally, and I fell apart personally, and it was just, you know, it was just one of those times in my life when I look back at it, the cosmic tumblers just weren't meant to drop for us at that time. And I wasn't willing to stick it out because, like I said, I wanted to raise my children. It was me that seceded, and so I quit the business.
We got Jose on the line.
Hey, guys, what's up? Hey, Max.
How's it going, Jose?
All right, man. Listen, I was listening to you, and your story, in a way, for me, it's kind of like sad because way back in the days, I remember I used to tune into the channels and watch, Monday Night Raw and stuff like that, and I used to see this guy, and Vince used to do the commentating at the time with Jerry Lawler and Jim Ross, and he would build you up so hard. He was like, Man Mountain Rock, and then you would come out with the guitar with the WWE logo, WWF.
Do you still have that guitar? Sorry to interrupt your question.
Yeah.
Who's that?
I thought it was...
Go on, I'll ask him after. Sorry, Jose.
Go ahead.
I'll just ask if you still had the guitar.
I do not.
Oh.
That's a part of my life that I'm sad to say I wasn't too sad to eliminate that from my life.
As much as a big fan as I was as Maxx Payne, I have to admit I was not a big fan of Man Mountain Rocks.
I don't blame you. Neither was I. So if I didn't like it, how could I convince anybody else I liked it? I agree with you.
Go on, Jose. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, but this is what I was trying to say. Max, you call yourself Maxx Payne now. I still think, okay, you raised your kids, and it's a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong, but just like I told Al Snow the last time he was here on the show, I said, you shouldn't just call it a career and that's it. And even for you, Max, you look great. I was online trying to tell these guys how if you shaved your head, and I'm not saying you should, you would look just like Bam Bam Bigelow because you look dangerous, you know what I mean? And if anything, it would be great if you went and showed up on TNA like Al Snow did just recently. You know what I'm saying? I don't think you're finished. I think you got a lot more in you. You know what I mean? What do you think?
Thank you, Jose, man. I appreciate that. But, I'm one of those guys. I'll be honest with you, Jose. I got into the wrestling business to get out of it because I guess maybe call me a little more pragmatic than a lot of the boys. First of all, I have a college education. And, I didn't foresee myself bumping until, a part of it was this. I saw guys like Flair and Iron Mike Sharp and these guys who, are 60 years old still out there bumping. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that the rest of my life. I'm not, especially when you're a 350-pound man. And, wrestling for me, by the time, in respect to the question, Jose, and, thank you so much for the compliment, but the truth of the matter is by the time, I got to that point, I was tired, man. I was really exhausted in the wrestling business. I was getting beat up. I was, I just had it. And, I think I very easily probably could pursue a wrestling career today, but the thought of going back into the business and bumping again and being a part of it, you know what? I have a different path I've chosen in my life, and I respect and love what the wrestling business gave me because it certainly gave me a place in history. Long after I'm dead and gone, my name will still be on the internet, and people will know who I was and what I did. But the truth of the matter is, the other side of that is, I like the idea. I mean, how many other wrestlers do you know who have left the business and then succeeded, independently outside of it? And that's kind of where I'm at. I'm one of those guys who I have a lot of other skills and talents in my life that are very passionate for me. And so I look forward to exploiting those talents and doing the things I really love, which music and, making music, being an engineer and making film. I have a big future in my life doing that, and my kids are all raised now. My kids have all graduated from high school and have their own independent lives. So here again from Maxx Payne, there's no question about it.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me be on the show, and for letting me call in.
Thanks for calling in, Jose.
Thanks, Max. Bye.
Thanks, Jose.
Let's get Brian on the line.
Oh, hey, how's it going?
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Max. I had a question for you. You were in WCW in the early 90s. Were you there at the time that the, what I like to call Scissor Gate, happened in England? I mean, were you there at the hotel at the time that went down? And I was just wondering what your opinion of it was. If you don't mind, you're not legally allowed to talk about it. I didn't.
Oh, I can talk about anything I want because I'm not in the business, man. I got to tell you, Eventually, like I said, I am a filmmaker, and eventually I have a screenplay that I will bring to the screen. And I was not only involved in it, I hate to say it, but I was probably one of the guys that caused Sid so much problem that night. If not, I was probably one of the lead guys that drove Sid into the frenzy he was in when we got back to the hotel. I was on the P-bus, and not many people know this, and I still have the T-shirt. I had to put the damn thing up for auction. People would probably just go out. I don't know if you guys know this, and I don't know how many people have ever told you this, but believe it or not, it was actually called the B-Bus Tour after that happened. And I actually have a T-shirt that the WCW management made after that tour because it was so legendary. They made like 50 T-shirts and gave them to the people that was on the bus. And it actually has wrestlers. God, you got to see this thing. I should post a picture of this on the internet. It actually has hands. It's kind of a caricature picture. It's the coolest thing you've ever seen. It's got a hand sticking out of the window with a pair of scissors in it. And wrestlers fighting and bottles of booze flying out the window and pot pipes and shit. It's just the coolest thing you've ever seen. You know, the B-Bus, I got to tell you, that was probably another incident that had a huge impact on me asking myself if this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Because I got to tell you, that's a time in my life, man. I was living wide open, and I hate to say it, if I would have continued down the path of self-destruction I was on at that time, I would be a statistic like all my friends, like Bam Bam and Kurt and Rude and, you know, all the guys that were part of that. So, you know, the B-Bus is true. It was insane. It was one of the most incredible incidences that ever, in fact, I will just say it. It absolutely was the most incredible incident that ever happened to me in the wrestling business. The ramifications of what happened afterwards were huge. It changed the WCW in a lot of ways. A lot of people, in terms of management, lost their jobs. Things changed dramatically. It is absolutely true. It was absolutely crazy. And for everybody that's calling it Scissor Gate or whatever they called it, it was actually called the B-Bus Tour. So that's the true name of that tour. And it was crazy. Bottom line is that was a very crazy moment in time.
How would you say, like, you said you're one of the guys... Yeah, thanks for calling in, Brian. You said you're one of the guys that kind of got Sid going. Were you, like, edging him on, or what was, like, the story behind that?
You know, Sid is one of those guys who... Sid always pissed me off in the wrestling business. Sid was one of those guys who had everything freaking handed to him on a silver platter, and he's the biggest pussy that ever walked the planet. He couldn't kick the shit out of a wet paper sack. And he pissed me off because he was one of those guys who had every break possible put in front of him, and he did everything in his power to completely annihilate himself and just betray himself to the boys. And yet when we'd get on the bus and you'd be in front of him, he would act like he was this incredible superstar in front of the boys. It's like, you know, Sid, you're on the bus with the boys, knock it off or you're going to get the shit slapped out of you. And anybody who knows anything knows Brian Pillman backed him down because he was afraid of Brian Pillman. Mm-hmm. You know, and so when we got on the bus that night, I happened to be in Memphis with Sid during an incident that pissed Sid off so greatly. I won't try to go into the whole story, but basically he got whooped in an arm wrestling match that just really blew him away. There used to be a tag team in Memphis called Rough and Ready. They were a small jobber team, a couple of black guys, and they were just the most incredibly nice guys. But their job was to, you know, they were jobbers, but they were great guys. They were local guys. They loved being on TV. It kept them popular in Memphis, and that's all they cared about. Well, one of them happened to be a world-class arm wrestler, and he only weighed about 150 pounds. And Sid comes in the dressing room one day on the gas, about 325 pounds, and everybody knew how good this guy was at arm wrestling, and this guy just buried Sid. I mean, honestly, it's funny Sid didn't get his arm broke by this guy. This guy was an amazing arm wrestler. He had the most powerful arms you could ever imagine. And he was one of those guys that was just, You know, I like to call it tendon strength or retard strength, whatever you want to call it. That's what it was.
Good, Jesse.
But he was amazing, dude. And he took Sid down so fast you could hear his knuckles crack on the table. And Sid was so pissed. He arm wrestled him both left and right-handed, and I was there. I was in the dressing room when that happened. Plus, I was in Memphis, or I was in WCW during the time he was there and the whole Brian Pillman incident happened. And incidentally, Brian Pillman was on the B-Bus the night of the B-Bus tour. So Sid got on the bus being really cocky, and he started talking crap to all the heels on the B-Bus about how badass he was. And finally, I had enough, and I just set forth to bury him. And the biggest mistake, you know, he could not dig out of it because he couldn't talk. You know, he was trying to talk crap about Brian, and Brian was 3 seats in front of him. And I said, hell, Sid, don't whisper. Brian's sitting right there. Speak out loud. Tell Brian what you really feel. He's sitting right in front of you. He's going, Max, stop it, man. You're just trying to wind me up. And I said, dude, it looks like I'm doing a good job. And then I brought up the whole incident of getting his ass kicked in the arm wrestling world, and Rick Rude was on the bus with us, right? Mm-hmm. Most people don't know this, but Rude was a world-class arm wrestler, too. Yeah. He was a badass. And Rude did, and so Sid goes, Rude, I could kick your ass in an arm wrestling match, and that was a huge mistake. Rude buried him harder than Rough and Ready did, brother. I mean, he just slammed his knuckles on the table, and Sid tried to cheat once and still got beat. And so I spent the whole night just needling Sid because I was pissed at him, man. I just had it. And Sid was so pissed, he knew he couldn't defend himself in front of all the heels. So and then on top of that night, the Nasty Boys were on the bus, and Sid took one of the Nasty Boys' Halliburton and stole drugs out of the case right in front of them, and they caught him in the process. And they were ready to cut his throat on the bus. They were gonna literally cut his throat on the bus. And you know what, man? He got off the bus like a beat redheaded stepchild, man. He was just tore up. So it wasn't illogical the next morning when I heard he'd gone to the bar and picked on Arn Anderson, which to this day, I don't know what in God's name. I mean, not only is Sid not tough, he's stupid. You know, you picked on Arn Anderson? God, why didn't you pick on Pee-wee or, you know, one of the refs, for God's sake? But now he's going to go to the restaurant and pick on Arn Anderson, one of the naturally toughest son of a bitches I've ever met in my life. It's like, Sid, not only are you freaking big and a pussy, now you're stupid. You're dumber than a bag of hammers. How dare you pick on Arn Anderson? You know what I mean? Right. So that was the thing. I never understood how he thought that somehow he could beat the hell out of Arn Anderson. You know, I don't care how tough Sid thought he was. And so, you know, it wasn't illogical. You know, it's kind of one of those things where you've had your ass kicked by a bunch of other people, so you beat somebody up that you feel like might be less tough than you. Right. Somehow Sid must have thought that about Arn. And I would have said to him, Jesus, you would have had a better shot at Pillman or, you know, Vader than goddamn Arn, for hell's sakes, you know. So that was part of the deal. To this day, I never understood why he chose Arn, you know. Right. It's like, Flair, pick on Flair. He's not tough, you know what I mean? But Arn, for God's sake, out of all the horsemen, that just seemed ridiculous to me. So anyway, it's one of those times where, you know, when he did that, it was like, you got to be ribbing me, Sid. So, yeah, that whole incident was really an incredible time in my life.
Mm-hmm. What was everyone thinking, like, after that happened? Did everyone think, like, you know, Sid's definitely getting fired, or, like, he might go to jail, or, you know, Arn might go to jail?
Quite frankly, I thought he should have gone to prison to knock on the door of somebody's hotel room and smash him in the head with the leg of a chair, you know, to blind smack somebody in the head. You know, he's lucky that Arn didn't kill him. He really is lucky to this day. Had it not been for Vader, Sid would have died. Vader saved his life. Vader stopped the bleeding because Sid had already bled out by the time he got to the front door of the hotel. And so, you know, had it not been for Vader, he would have bled to death in the lobby of the hotel we were staying at. You know, we were all pissed because they blamed, you know, the office blamed us for Sid's behavior. You know, why didn't you fire that prick? And, you know, how many times did Sid have a run after that?
You know, at what point does a guy be such, and, you know, I've done some shit in my life, but compared to what Sid did, you know, supposedly I'm blackballed in the wrestling business, which I don't really care. It doesn't bug me because I never wanted to go back. But Sid's been back, you know, 50 freaking times, and I've never understood. This guy did such bullshit things in his life. You know, the whole thing with Brian Pillman. You know, why didn't Vince fire him on the spot? Instead, they bought him a dozen squeegees and painted him pink. You know, I mean, it's like, how does this guy manage? Just because he was, you know, it's the truth of the matter is, Vince just loves great big guys that are built like bodybuilders, and Sid fit that body type to the T, didn't he? So as a result of that, Sid just managed to always skate through. Hence the reason I was always so pissed off at Sid, and the B-Bus is what drew me to the point where, that's it, I'm not taking it no more, and I don't care if I lose my job because of it. Right. So it was a rough time after the B-Bus. The office sent over Ole, and Ole was like the babysitter on the bus, for Christ's sakes. So we had to ride around with Ole so we'd all be good boys after that was all over, which I never understood. Hey, Sid's off the bus. There's not going to be a problem now, you know? So
what was the story with him and Pillman? I've always heard about it. I've never actually heard, like, the actual story.
Same thing. He just thought he could, you know, and leave it to Sid. You know, he would never pick on somebody like Vader or me. You know, he always would pick on people he thought he could. Sid was such a typical bully. He would pick on people he thought he could pick on. And it just so happened that Brian Pillman was one of them. And I thought to myself, again, if you knew Brian, that guy was just tougher than nails. He was just one of the, I wouldn't have messed with Brian. Brian was just a tough guy. You know, there are people in the world, I don't care how good of a wrestler you are, you can beat them down, take them down, stretch them, break their arm, whatever. They'd come back and beat you to death with a baseball bat just because they were such tough son of a bitches. And Brian was one of those guys. So in the middle of being mad at somebody else, I think it was Arn again, in the middle of being mad at somebody else, he picked on Brian Pillman. And Brian said, Sid, I'll kick your ass right now. Now, here's a 6'7", 325-pound steroid king. The guy's got muscles coming out of muscles. He calls Brian Pillman down. Instead of just facing the guy and fighting him one-on-one, he goes out to his Cadillac, and the only thing he could find in the trunk of his Cadillac was a squeegee, and comes back in to threaten to beat Brian Pillman up with a squeegee, for God's sakes. What in God's name was he thinking? You need a squeegee, and that's what Brian just laughed at him. You know, a squeegee, Sid? How about a gun? How about a bat? How about a mace, for God's sake? But a squeegee? What damage are you going to cause with a squeegee? And besides that, look at your arm. Your biceps 24 inches around. Just laying that meat hook on me should cause damage. And Sid just is, he was such a typical big pussy. He just, like, pulled his tutu up and ran out of the building on his tippy toes, he was just not a fighter. Sid got in the business because the business is at work, and he counted on people succeeding to him and happened to be a badass to prove he was tough, because Sid is not tough.
Mm-hmm. Now, you brought up steroids a couple times. Someone asked about drugs in wrestling. What are your opinions on steroids in wrestling? Do you think they're needed? Do you think they're bad for wrestling?
I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again. First of all, America loves big, strong-looking dudes. The wrestling business is not spontaneous athletics where the best guy wins, and it's a competition to see who the best guy in the world is. It's a show to entertain people, and if you ever lose sight of that, then you forget that what it's designed to do. It's classic theater with professional wrestling as its backdrop. And so, one of the things when you consider what professional wrestling is, and when you're talking about guys who are on the road for 340 days a year, getting their asses kicked every night, one thing about anabolic steroids, and people don't understand this, is used correctly, they're very, very good. Most drugs are. They have a beneficial effect. They're designed to help you, not to deter. But just like anything, when you abuse them, they become dangerous. In professional wrestling, wrestlers get their asses kicked so regularly to not have something to help you recover quickly. And that's what anabolic steroids do. They allow your body to recover quicker when you have an injury or when you're lifting and when you're pushing your body the way you're pushing it. And done correctly, steroids are a very beneficial thing.
unfortunately, like any drug, you put them in the hand of somebody who thinks they know what they're doing and is an addict or a potential abuser of them. They have very dangerous side effects, including death. And as we've seen with Chris Benoit, God knows what the other level of that psychosis is. So I've always believed steroids should not be something that people look down on wrestlers, because I truly believe that they are a very worthwhile tool to help wrestlers get through the daily grind of wrestling. Unfortunately, when you put drugs in somebody's hands, it's so typical. How many times have you seen this even in cartoons? If I take one, I get this big, but if I take 20, I get this big.
Right.
That's the danger in steroids. And wrestlers don't get monitored by doctors when they're using steroids. Actually, my hometown doctor, God rest his soul, Dr. Doyle Barrett, he gave me a legal prescription of Decadurabolin, and I took it for 8 weeks, and he monitored my health and made sure I was okay, and, everything was good. But the truth of the matter is they get abused. And when something is powerful that changes the entire physical makeup of your body, as anabolic steroids, is in the hands of an addict, you're facing big, big problems. And that's exactly why they're a problem, because they're not overseen. I personally think there is room in the wrestling business for steroids. However, they are abused. And when they are abused, there's the danger.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think it's that you definitely need, like you're saying, people want to see big guys. They don't want to see, just guys they can see, next door. That's something you need in wrestling?
Well, I mean...
Or just someone that stands out?
Isn't wrestling based on image? I mean,
right.
The whole guy... I mean, look at the Ultimate Warrior. You certainly didn't watch the Ultimate Warrior because he was a great worker.
Right.
As one of my great friends in the business said one time, he said, the Ultimate Warrior is that guy that runs to the ring, and he's great until the bell rings, and then it's over,
Right.
That's just the way the deal was. Nobody ever said the Ultimate Warrior was a great worker. His gimmick was great until the bell rang.
Right.
Because he looked fantastic. That's why Vince loved him so much. Because he looked freaking great in the ring, and he would put up with the fact that he wasn't a good worker, which, in my opinion, is the demise of the wrestling business. It's kind of the counter of what the wrestling business is about. What makes the wrestling business great and what takes the business away from people? That's why, look at The Rock. He was such a charismatic worker, man. Mm-hmm. People love to watch the guy. I mean, nobody would say he was a great worker, just like Hogan, but they're so charismatic in the ring that the way they could tell the story, it didn't matter whether they were the greatest wrestlers or not. They had the ability to use the art of the wrestling business to tell great stories. That's what people love about the wrestling business. Good versus evil. Good wins because basically they're pure, and they win because they fight fair. And, of course, this has all changed a lot.
Yeah.
But basically the premise has always got to stay the same. Mm-hmm. It's good versus evil, and good triumphs in the end, even if it's only for the moment, because, the heel's going to hit the ring and gimmick the guy so that they can set an angle for the next WrestleMania. And that's where the art of the wrestling business, I think, has been lost. When you got guys that all they care about is what their bodies look like, then the story gets lost. And when the story gets lost, I don't care. I mean, look at some of the great movies that they spent millions and millions of dollars on, and you go and watch them, and it's like, I mean, a classic example is the last 3 Star Wars movies. They were good, but their story, by comparison to the first 3, stank front row and center, in my opinion.
And they didn't have the characters like the first 3.
They spent trillions of dollars so that the thing looked great on film, but the story sucked. Mm-hmm. Clint Eastwood's a great director because all Clint Eastwood ever cares about, first and foremost, if the story's good, it will sell no matter how bad the production is. If the production's good, it doesn't matter how good the production is. If the story stinks, it sucks. And that's the truth.
Mm-hmm. Along those lines, you're saying about you need the good versus evil. Do you think when people say today heels and baby faces are passé, that it's not entirely true? Like Austin, he might have been not a typical baby face, but he was still portrayed as the hero of the show you were watching, and McMahon was definitely the bad guy.
Well, and look at Austin. In the end, you still had to use heel tactics to beat him. You still had to be a great heel to beat him, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
When Steve did the job and lost, it was because somebody cheated and nobody beat him 1, 2, 3 in the middle of the ring and beat him for, so that just doesn't happen.
You know, Austin, regardless, he was a baby face who rode the edge of the lightning bolt, but he was still a great baby face because he appealed. You know what it is? I heard this. You know, I had this. Somebody tell me this once before. I don't remember who it was. Somebody great in the wrestling business. If you're an ass kicker, it doesn't matter. People like people who are tough.
Right.
If you're a tough son of a bitch, it don't matter. People are going to think of you as a baby face. And that's why guys like Austin, he can't stay heel because he's just such a naturally tough son of a bitch. How can you not like the guy?
Yeah.
That's American, isn't it, man?
Yeah, it's like Legion of Doom.
Names later. What was that?
I was like the Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors. Like, you know, eventually they just had to turn babyface because people love those guys.
Yeah, they were great workers. They were just fantastic at being tough son of a bitches. You know, that's just the way it was. And so, you know, you can't take that away from people, but you still have to maintain the classic babyface heel mentality. If that ever goes away, which it does, it goes away in cycles, and Vince is really good at renegotiating that and figuring out how to find that new the new approach, and he'll find it now. You know, the business goes in cycles, and I've been told that many times since I got in the business. In fact, Red Bastien told me when I first broke into business, you can kick it, you can stomp on it, you can throw it in the dirt, you can drag it through the mud, but you can't kill it. It just ain't going to go away.
We got a Buck here on the line.
Yeah.
You got a question?
Oh, yeah. Did you think that the Raven character was similar to your character in WCW?
You know, it's funny you'd ask me that. I spent a lot of time with Scott in Memphis. And when Scott first came to Memphis, he was an absolutely traditional babyface with, you know, K&H tights and B-Bar A boots. And, you know, he came there with the short hair and the typical babyface pose. And in the end, I certainly am not going to take credit for having an influence on anybody. If I did, I'll let them tell you that. But I've looked at the business many a times at a lot of different wrestlers, Taker included. I think you'd have to say, you know, I preceded these guys, man. I was, you know, when I went to Memphis, I was the first guy doing the dark thing. And I don't know if they give me credit. I don't really care. They were great wrestlers, but what I did was what I did. And before what I did, nobody else did it. There was nobody wearing the kind of tights I was. There was nobody dressing the way I was before I did it. And so for that, I'm going to have to say I had an influence on a lot of people, whether they'd admit it or not. It doesn't really matter. I think that's one of those things you have to look at that character and decide for yourself. You know, because I think we all can look at things and go, yeah, there's no doubt about it, that guy got some ideas from this guy, and I think that's just the way that goes. You know, and for that, if somebody can take something that you do, I consider that a compliment, not a slam.
Do you have anything else, Buck?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks for calling in, man. We got Brian on the line. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
This is Brian Danovich.
Yeah, I'm sorry to make a habit of call in, but this guy, he speaks so intelligently. Like, you know, being in the business, when you hear someone else talk like this, it's incredible. But I get that later. But I just wanted to know, man, you were a great amateur, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
Well, you know, great always can be subjective. I had a good amateur career. I was a 3-time All-American and a national champion on a national championship team, and I still hold a record in the NCAA for the most falls in the national tournament. I had 5 pins in 5 minutes and 32 seconds. So let's put it this way. I had a great career, and for what I wanted to accomplish, it got me a college education. So if you want to call that a great career, then I'll accept that graciously. Thank you.
Brother, I will call that great, absolutely. A hell of a lot better than mine was. So the point I'm trying to make here is, did you have trouble like a lot of guys? Because I know I did, and it took me a while, and Taz said he had this happen, and a bunch of other people, like Angle. Did you have trouble early on, pretty much, you know, having to sit there and give yourself to someone when you're so used to going out there and the referee blows the whistle and you just want to go and, you know, grab the headlock or rip someone's head off and get the quickest pin? Was it a little bit hard? Because I sure as hell know it was for me to adjust that now you got to kind of slow down and work with somebody, and you got to, you know, realize that we're here to make money.
You got to do the job, man. Let me tell you something. It wasn't, and I'll tell you why. The reason it wasn't, from the early conception of my character and my early, from very early on in my, how can I say this? Very early on, from the very moment I was introduced to the professional wrestling business, and you find out that it's a work, what happens to you then is you have to make a decision. And it was easy for me because I was already an actor. I'd already been in front of the camera. And if you're playing a character, then what does it matter if you go out there and you get beat every night? I'm not going out there to try to prove I'm a better wrestler. I'm trying to go out there and entertain the people. And for me, entertaining people is what the wrestling business is about. It's such a great business. Where else on earth do you have the opportunity to stand in front of 25,000 people by yourself with another guy, with two other guys in a ring, and literally, I heard Schwarzenegger, I can't remember the exact Schwarzenegger said in the movie Pumping Iron, but Dr. Death, Steve Williams, said something to me once, and I love this, the way he described it. I think it's perfect for what professional wrestlers do. What we do every night is we masturbate the audience, and we tell them when it's their turn to have an orgasm. Just when they think we're going to let them have an orgasm, you have the power to cut them off. It is such a powerful position to be in when you're out there and you're in complete control of a crowd and everything's working and all your high spots are flying and finish goes off like gangbusters and the whole crowd has a spontaneous orgasm at your command. It truly is like masturbating 20,000 people, or if it's a pay-per-view, 1 million people all at once. It's such an amazing feeling. And I don't know, I just got that right from the beginning. I realized very early on that it wasn't about going out there and being a badass. It was about going out there and figuring out how to dance as best you can with the guy standing across from you. And so I never had a problem with that. I really didn't. I actually embraced quite dramatically how much I loved that kind of control. Because in amateur wrestling, you don't have that. In amateur wrestling, you just go out there and work your ass off, and if you lose or win, it doesn't matter. The crowd response is really not dictated by that. Most of the people who watch amateur wrestlers are very educated people in terms of amateur wrestling, and they understand how two people could stand and face each other for 6 minutes, and at the end of 6 minutes be exhausted and never have done anything but just push each other around if they don't get a takedown or whatever. Professional wrestling is absolutely. It's completely different. And so I always embraced the fact that I loved crowd control, man. I loved the fact that done correctly, it was an amazing thing. And Dick Murdoch, God rest his soul, I spent 3 or 4 tours in Japan with him, and he taught me a very, very good lesson. He told me, I'd been in the business for about a year by the time I saw him, the very last time I saw him over there, and he said to me, the wrestling business, it takes you 10 years to get to the point where you truly understand that. And there are a lot of people, like The Rock's a classic example, who just got that very early on in their career. For most guys like myself, by the time I quit the business, I really just started to get it. You know what I mean? And most of these young guys, they don't get that yet. And so, honestly, brother, I never had that problem. And if you're a young guy out there and you're listening to what I'm saying right now, I hope that it's imparting something to you. Embrace that rather than going against it, because if you embrace that as an amateur wrestler, your potential in the wrestling business is huge, because you realize the truth of the matter is, and you know this as well as I do, if you went out there and did an amateur wrestling match in front of a pro crowd, they'd fart on you quick. They'd be booing your ass, chanting boring, quick. They don't give a shit how bad ass you are. They want to see you bump and do high spots. They don't care about nothing else. And so I embraced that very quickly. That's why, for me, I loved it and I embraced it, and I never had a problem with it.
Well, I actually, and I'm glad you explained it that way. I was just wondering more so the training, as far as like the first minute you stepped in the ring and somebody, is getting a hold of you, and like right away, did you have to be told, hey, loosen up? Hey, like I'm not talking about as your career progressed. I just mean like, the minute you got in the ring, you right away were able to realize, hey, okay, what I did before, I was, balls to the walls. Now I got to ease up and work with this person like right away?
Yeah, well, I think the truth of the matter is you have to remember that if you went out there and you went in that mode, and you know this better than anybody, brother, is you go out there and you do that, you're going to be stuck in oxygen through every orifice in your body as quickly as you can. And usually you're going out there to try and do, 12 to 15 minutes, sometimes 20, sometimes 25. So you have to take a completely different approach. I think the one thing that amateur wrestling does for you is you understand that truly better than anybody. And quite frankly, to me, the fact that it was a work, that you weren't trying to take the other guy down and see who was the better wrestler, I loved it because, for me, I'm speaking strictly subjectively here, for me, it was easy because I knew I didn't have anything to prove that way. I'd already proven myself in the amateur ranks. So to go out there and dance, if you will, became the challenge. And to be a good dancer, you have to be patient. You have to be good. You have to understand push-pull and give and take. And so I very quickly understood professional wrestling is a completely different animal than amateur wrestling, and I love that.
That's
so I hope that answered your question, man.
No, it totally did. And if I could just get one more here, I'm a gimmick guy, and I always have been, because I feel like, anybody can go out in a pair of generic tights, like you had said, the K&H tights, look the same body, same hairstyle, and then all of a sudden, it's like you see the same thing over and over. And for some reason, when you got up and you did the, well, first of all, I think, you got a Raw deal in WCW where they were pushing you and Cactus, and then all of a sudden Kevin Sullivan puts himself in the fold and the strap gets put on him. And I kind of felt like that was more so used as like an Emmy or an Academy Award. And I felt that was something you would deserve because you guys were getting over so good and representing that era of the way the music with the grunge and everything was taking over and the way wrestling was changing. And I felt like, Kevin Sullivan coming in and taking basically what was your award kind of sucked. And that always pissed me off because I was always a big fan of the gimmick. And I was always a big fan that you were different. And did that bother you at all back then, or did you just figure out, you know what, he's one of the bookers, I just do what I'm told and move on?
Well, first of all, there's a huge backstory to that, and the backstory is, I'll give it to you in as much of a nutshell as I can. First of all, if you know the Nasty Boys or you've been around them, they don't mind taking advantage of people, and anybody who's wrestled with the Nasty Boys knows that if you give them an inch, they'll take 137 miles. That's the nature of those guys. And everybody knows about the incident when I broke Knobs' shoulder, and I didn't break his shoulder intentionally. I'll say this again in public again. But I told Knobs and Sags that night because they had basically always called the shots. We had listened to everything they wanted to do, and that was one of those nights that I said, you know what? You guys aren't calling the shots tonight. You're either gonna do what I tell you to do, or I'm telling you right now, I'm gonna take it. The choice is yours, Knobs. You're either gonna do what I tell you to do, or I'm gonna take it. And if you try and stop me, you're gonna get hurt. And I said that to him before the match. He goes, "Whoa, Payne, you don't gotta go there." And I said, "Yeah, I do, because you guys will just take the piss out of me if I don't stand up for myself, and I'm not gonna let you take the piss out of me." And so this was one of those times when I stood up for myself, and after I hurt Knobs, that was my demise in the wrestling business. I got to be honest with you, because Brian went out of his way to make sure he buried me because he's such a pussy. He couldn't handle the fact that somebody had gone out there and embarrassed him because he was a dumbass. I warned him. I told him, go with what I'm doing. If you don't, you're going to get hurt. And he didn't go. And he likes to say to this day that I did it intentionally. It wasn't my intentionality that caused him to get his shoulder broke. It was his own stupidity that caused him to get hurt that night. And if he would have done what I was doing and gone with me and been a good dancer instead of trying to be a badass.
So he didn't know how to do business.
No, he didn't know how to do business. He got hurt because I told him he was going to get hurt if he didn't do it my way. And Eric Bischoff was so pissed off at me that night, he pulled me aside and said, "What are you doing, Max?" And I said to him right then, and anybody who knows, nobody was there but me and Eric, but this is the God's truth. I looked him right in the eyeballs and said,
Bill Eadie, who was, I think he was Smash in Demolition. When I worked with him in Japan and spent a bunch of time with him in Japan, he said, you know, Max, there comes a time in your wrestling career when you have to say no. And if you don't say no, the only guy you got to blame is the man in the mirror. And you know what? That was the night I said no. And I didn't care if I lost my career because I was never afraid to not be a professional wrestler because I knew I could do other things. And so I stood up for myself, and it cost me my career in the wrestling business, basically. And for that, I don't regret it, because I would rather leave the wrestling business having kicked Brian Knobbs' ass in front of God and all their angels than to have been another pussy that just did what those guys thought they were going to tell me to do. And you can talk to them to this day, and if they tell you anything different, they're lying to you. But they didn't shove me around that night, and they never shoved me around again, except when they took advantage of us in the big street fight. But even if you look at the street fight that we did in Chicago, they gave me a hell of a lot. But they took, you know, the thing they did to Cactus, what they did to me at the end of that show when they hit me in the head with the table, when Brian hit me, or when Sags hit me in the head with the table, that was a shoot. They were trying to hurt me. They were trying to kill me. And from that moment on, there's actually, I did get my last hit in, and that was when we were in Philadelphia, I believe, and I smashed my guitar over either Knobbs or Sags' head, and basically that was my last match at the WCW.
You had to take your receipt. You had to take your receipt pretty much.
Absolutely. So I took it, but the truth of the matter, though, the difference is it wasn't my receipt. I'd already taken my receipt long before I gave that one to Knobbs, because Knobbs had hurt me time and time again before that match came. And Knobbs got his receipt that night. The truth of the matter is, when I broke Knobbs' shoulder, he got his receipt for all the shit he'd done to me prior to that night. That's the truth of the matter. So it wasn't me taking a receipt from him. It was me getting my receipt for all the crap he'd done to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, all I just want to say is it's an honor to, you taking the time to talk to these guys. And like I had said, I was just trying to get in this real quickly. I have been a gimmick guy predominantly because when I first started and I went out in a singlet and a pair of boots, and I had that amateur mentality. I talked to these guys when I was on their show, and I said it's everybody has to be a tough guy and a badass syndrome where, everybody wants to be, the Taz, I'm going to choke you out or I'm going to break your body part. And I realized, that's not going to get noticed. And when I realized that, I started to wear the different colored outfits and the flashy clothes and coincidentally the tie-dye. Now, I got to be honest, man. I really liked the Man Mountain Rock character and the playing the guitar before the match. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it was something that back then, it got a lot of time in the magazines. It got a lot of exposure on the Superstars programs and stuff. And the pyro was just starting to come out, and they were really utilizing that and the merchandising and stuff. And I felt like it was something different, and I felt like it was something that was honestly getting ready to go somewhere. And what did you feel about it? Because I mean, it was like they were giving you something, and they were utilizing you. And did you like it, or did you feel like, you know what, I got to go out and do this now, going from this dark character to now I got to go, be a little bit more of a sports entertainer and make people happy?
Well, I think you nailed it on the head, man. The problem for me was I personally created the entire Maxx Payne persona. Everything about Maxx Payne was my own personal, my own Alice Cooper, if you will, my own dark side. And so for me, and this is one of the things I'd like to say to you, man, if somebody tries to put a suit on you that doesn't fit, it's like, I'll be honest, this is a great analogy in the sense that have you ever bought a pair of shoes on sale that were your size, but you put them on, and no matter how hard you try to wear those shoes, they still cause blisters? There comes a point in your life where, I could not sell the Man Mountain Rock character because it wasn't me. And regardless, I've sat here and told you, well, I'm an actor and I love doing that. But the truth of the matter was, it was so far removed from my own creation
it made it very, very, very difficult for me to believe it. And I've always said, if you don't believe your own gimmick, how in God's green earth can you expect somebody else to believe your gimmick if it doesn't start with you? And that was always the problem with the Man Mountain Rock character. I'm certainly not going to say anything but thanks to Vince for what he did to me, or did for me, because he did a lot of great things for me. But the Man Mountain Rock character just didn't fit me at all. And so for me, it became a burden rather than going out there, because I thought to myself, you know, I can't do this my whole life, because this is not me. I'm the dark character. I'm the guy who plays heavy metal. I'm the guy who does this. And so I say to any wrestler, you know, just like you were talking about, brother, if you go out there wearing K&H tights and patent leather boots, you know what? And you hate it, man, you ain't got nobody to look at and blame but the guy in the mirror. If you don't feel it and you don't believe it, there ain't nobody in that crowd that's going to believe it. I don't care how hard you try. You have to believe your character wholeheartedly. So I say to you, the Man Mountain Rock character didn't fit me. I don't hate it, but it wasn't me. It wasn't created by me. It was created by Titan. And because it was created by Titan, it wasn't what I wanted to be. And I begged them to let me do that. But because they had Taker, and because the NWO was going down, like I said, there was no way that anybody was going to let me be a dark character, which to me was stupidity. There's all kinds of people in the wrestling business. You know, at the time, God, there was 30 guys. What would it have mattered if there was 31, especially if I believed the character wholeheartedly? You know, so it was always difficult. I begged Vince to let me be Maxx Payne in the WWF, and they just wouldn't let me do it, man, because I really think they thought it would take away from Taker. And I mean, maybe that's not the truth. I don't know. Maybe Vince didn't want to go that route. But the truth of the matter was, I didn't buy it. And so since I didn't buy it, I couldn't sell it. And I take responsibility for that. I really do. I should have fought with Vince a little harder and said, you know what, we got to do something different. This ain't me, and it ain't working. Certainly we can come up with something different. And it just never worked.
You think maybe it's
so
just
your heart wasn't into it?
I was just saying maybe it's just because he didn't come up with the character, because a lot of times when they bring in somebody who has like a known character, they always make up a new character for him, so it's something that WWE created.
Any chance of a talks with Jeremy Padawer or Peter Skatoris for a Classic Superstars figure?
You know what? Nobody's ever contacted me about anything like that. You know,
that's a shame.
So
that's a shame.
If they did, I would certainly be interested in talking to them about it, because I think there are still quite a few Maxx Payne fans out there.
Hell yeah, man! I wish you could shoot a bad blaster in Mark Merrill's face today, but have it be for real. But that's another story. All right, on that note, man, thank you so much. I appreciate you talking to me, and thanks for doing the show. And I wish you nothing but the best, sir.
Thanks for calling in, Brian.
All right, take care.
We got an area code 828.
Oh, hey, how's it going?
He's been on hold for a while. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, my name's Kip. I just actually just ran across your website and just started looking at it about a month ago. But you guys run a really good ship. I really enjoy the call-ins and the things, and thanks to Max for hanging on tonight. So
thanks.
But,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I just had a couple quick questions. They kind of tied into a couple things from earlier too. But you mentioned the in-ring performance, the charisma, and things like that. And then we kind of pair that against like the figure thing, how good the guys look in the ring, how muscular they are. Which one do you think is really more important in getting over? Because you see people like The Rock, and I think of those guys as more of an anomaly than the norm. Because he had the figure, but he also had the charisma to get over. But then you have some of these guys, like I think Trevor Murdoch right now. He first comes in, and if you watch this stuff, it's still on the day. It's nowhere near the way it used to be, or near as good. But he reminded me of like Stan Hansen and Big Murdoch, and I thought he could have gotten over great as a heel, but then Lance Cade ends up getting a push, and he's the muscular guy. But just what are your thoughts on charisma in the ring and getting over with the fans versus having to build? What's the give and take there?
Let me compare this to the music industry, because I think there's a great because I do a lot of
of engineering and producing musically, and I've done a lot in the last, 15 years since I left the wrestling business. I worked with the legend Steve Miller quite a few times, and he's an amazing guy. And one time he said to me, a great performance and a crappy recording is still a great performance. But a great recording and a crappy performance is just a crappy performance that sounds really great.
Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
And you can compare that to the wrestling business. Guys who are strictly muscle guys, and I'm going to have to liken it to Sid. I don't think Sid ever really rose as high as he'd like to think he did rise. I think the push that Sid got was strictly because he did look good in the ring, but once he got there, his charisma couldn't carry it because Sid was just not the real deal. To me, there are a lot of guys in the wrestling business who are incredible characters who don't have bodies, who had great, great careers. And there are a lot of guys who are bodybuilders that had good careers and still are today. But I honestly believe it doesn't matter what your body type is. If you're a great and charismatic wrestler and you concentrate on, here's the thing you got to remember, and this is my point, and a classic example of the story I was telling you earlier about the rock and roll thing is, let's talk about Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem at Woodstock. Nobody would tell you that's a great recording, but would anyone deny that that's one of the greatest performances in the history of guitar playing? It had nothing to do with it had nothing to do with what the film looked like. It had nothing to do with what the sound equipment was like. It had to do with the fact that Jimi Hendrix was a fantastic performer, and he could have stood up there with a freaking acoustic guitar and a little teeny pig nose amp and blown everybody's ass off the stage because it was Jimi Hendrix. It's just like Eddie Van Halen. I know 1,000 guitar players who have every guitar on the planet, the greatest amplifiers and everything, but they can't play. Eddie Van Halen could take a pawn shop guitar and make it sound like he's a virtuoso because he is a virtuoso. If you're good at your craft, and that's one of the things that I'd like to say to anybody who loves the wrestling business and any aspiring wrestler, if you love the business, then be great at the craft. The body is only a vehicle for you to accentuate the ability to be a great craftsman. That's all it is. If you're a great craftsman and you don't have a great body, you can still get a great push. Classic example. Look at guys like Honky Tonk Man. He didn't have a great body. That guy was amazing, man. I watched him have fantastic matches throughout his career. Was it because he had a great body, or was it because he was an incredible storyteller? Focus on being a storyteller first, and you'll be a great wrestler. If you're a great storyteller, your body is secondary, and no matter how much you think, Vince will not be able to ignore you if you're a great storyteller. If you can tell a story, you can be a professional wrestler. Just having a body does not make you a great wrestler, and that's my point. Vince is queer for that shit. Be as queer as you want, but in the end, it will be the demise of the wrestling business, because in the end, what matters is the art of the business, and the art of the business is telling a story in the ring. And if you ever forget that about the wrestling business, you're forgetting what it's about. It is about drama. People go to the wrestling business to be entertained first and foremost. It's like the Ultimate Warrior. He was great till the bell rang. Classic example.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of goes back. I just listened this morning to the podcast with Chris Cruz, and he said, he thought at some point, maybe recently, he's been either getting too old for it or outgrowing the pro wrestling, or he said it just wasn't as fun to him. And I just don't think there's that many good characters anymore as there used to be. I don't know. It just seems like me.
But don't you feel that? Because let me ask you a question. Don't you feel that way? Because the old, here's the thing. Look what Vince has done to the wrestling business. The wrestling business now, if you want to be a professional wrestler, where in the hell do you go? If it takes you 10 years to be a good storyteller, where in the hell do you go to learn how to tell the story of the business? It used to be there were tons of little territories you could go to and learn how to tell the story before you got your shot in the big league, right? Before you got your shot in the show. Now that doesn't exist. Now guys think they've been in the wrestling business and done, weekend shows for 6 months. They think they're ready for the WWF. Well, it doesn't work that way, man. The
wrestling business is an art, and you've got to be an artist, and it takes a long time to be an accomplished artist unless you are a freak like The Rock or some of the guys who did get pushes and really understood it. The Rock, he understood how to tell a story very early on. In fact, that's what Dwayne was really good at, man, was telling the story. So I would say that the reason you feel that way is because the great storytellers and the ability for people to learn how to be great storytellers is gone. That doesn't exist anymore. Vince will take guys out of put them in the business, give them a big shove, and they've been in the business for a year. You know what? You're not ready for a shove in the business after being in it for a year because you're going to have the wrong attitude. You won't be humble, and you won't respect the craft of the business.
See, I can absolutely identify with that because I think since there's only really one, that in TNA, and then you got Ring of Honor, but, I mean, you really only have one big-time show. And, I mean, who's their competition? I mean, they're pulling in, 0.9s on ratings.
Yeah.
There's just no reason to make it as interesting. You kind of can half-ass everything in there, it seems like. But, whatever.
I've always thought wrestling I've always wanted to do a wrestling show that was a funny caricature of the Vince show, and at this point, it's not even a caricature any longer. I always wanted to have a wrestling show that was just the guys in the back room debating, doing their interviews and shit. And every time they say, "Okay, let's go to the ring," they cut to a commercial, and you never actually ever see a wrestling match. The whole thing is just these guys in the back room telling stories about getting their asses kicked and fighting, and show highlights that are all staged, stills of guys' staged highlights. Because really, that's what Vince has basically reduced it to now. It's basically name me the last time that you saw a 45-minute wrestling match that had people on their feet from the beginning to the end, and every single high spot, every single false finish had everybody in the crowd going, oh, it doesn't happen anymore. That's why I'm not even interested in watching it. The classics, the great guys who could tell great stories, Ricky Steamboat, Macho Man, all the great workers that have came and gone, they don't exist anymore because the old-time mentality is dead. And I'm not sure how you're ever going to get it back. And until it comes back and you figure out how to tell the story and show the craft in its true glory and its true light, I really think the wrestling business will struggle until that happens. Or it has another iconographic character like The Rock or Stone Cold that shows up that just drags it out of the depths again.
I think that would make an excellent show for Showtime or HBO, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't that be funny, man? Just the whole thing
that would be great.
On interviewed. You heard it here first, you guys.
Well, when we had New Jack on, I actually mentioned that it would be good for him to have a reality show. And then actually just recently they announced that he's having a reality show on DVDs.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if anyone takes an idea, maybe at least give me some credit. Give us some credit.
Kidding. That's what I say too. But the wrestling business is infamous for stealing people's gimmick and not giving them credit. So don't count on it, brother.
Thanks for calling in, Kev. Was it Kevin?
Hey, thanks a lot. Kev.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, I had one more quick question, if I could.
All right.
Is it okay? Or?
Yep. Go ahead,
How do you think? What do you compare, or how do you think the announcers of today compare with the older guys like the Foleys and Bob Cottles and stuff? I think kind of some of the guys today get a little bit repetitive, whereas those old guys really had a way with words and pulling you into the action and the stories that were going on and building it up a little bit better.
Well, but then again, Jeff, isn't it the same exact thing that we're just talking about? How are the announcers any different than the old timers? You look at Gene Okerlund, or you look at the old timers who I can't think of his name right now. He was Bobby the Brain. These guys, they were old time classics. They understood the wrestling business from a creative standpoint that the new guys don't get. And the reason they don't get it is because how many guys in the wrestling business were married to old-timers on the road and learned from people who knew the business in a way that the business doesn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, every element of the wrestling business is affected by this gotta-have-it-right-now mentality. You know, and I'm not sure there's a cure for it, brother. I really don't think there is. But it's going to happen that way all through the wrestling business because those people don't exist anymore. The old-timers are going away quickly. The guys who are the classics from the 80s and the 90s, how many of them are left around? They're dropping like freaking flies. And so the result of that, you got people who were sports broadcasters or guys who, you know, grew up in the business in a different era when it's been the non-storytelling era, when it's been the era of, you know, instant gratification versus the guys who grew up paying the price to be a wrestler because they lived it, breathed it, slept it, did everything to be the best of their craft they could be. And I think that's going to be passed down through every element of the wrestling business.
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot for taking the time. I appreciate you guys doing the show. It was great. I love listening to it.
Oh, well, thanks.
My pleasure, Kip.
Thank you very much.
Did you have a question from the message board there, Inchman?
Yes, I actually did. PHU, he wants to know, are you still planning on releasing your documentary, The Thing That Should Not Be?
You know, I still wrestle with that. You know, that's a dilemma for me because I pull it out and look at it every once in a while, and, you know, it's one of those things that it's amazing because now 4 of the people in the movie are dead. And it's got some just amazing pieces in it. And the other thing about it is it's such a great, you know, I got to say honestly, it's really kind of boring, and yet that's what I want to show people. If you remember, I did that. I shot that thing in 1995 when OJ trial. I actually went on tour right the day that the OJ trial ended. And, you know, I was the first guy to say, will somebody let me do a reality show, basically, behind the scenes of the wrestling business? Because I wanted people to see the real deal. So it's a little bit of a dilemma for me because I do have tremendous respect for the guys that are dead, guys like Bam Bam and Owen and, you know, Yokozuna and everybody that's in Louie. You know, those guys and their families, you know, I wrestle with the dilemma consistently of, you know, releasing it and having them see it, and you know, it's a heavy burden. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to release it. I might have to say The Thing That Should Not Be may stay being the thing that should not be until I've passed away, and that might be 30 more years. I don't know, but I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I'm still a little up in the air on that because, quite frankly, it is an amazing piece of film, and I think every true, like, hardcore wrestling fans, like, obviously listen to your show, Jack, I think they would love it, and I think the wrestling world would just love it because it does give you an inside glimpse that's truly not very tainted. You know, it's truly just life on the road as a wrestler. And so I wrestle with that occasionally. We'll just have to wait and see. That's kind of where I'm at. It may have to happen after I'm long gone. I don't know. I won't make a promise either way, but you never know. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Maybe a bootleg version could come over to the In Your Head studio sometime.
I have a feeling if one DVD got out there, that especially in the world of the internet, it'd be like the freaking Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson video. It'd be gone before I even had a chance to say anything about it. So you never know. There are a few other people out there, major television organizations that have it, and you know, maybe they'll leak it. Who knows? You just never know. But I like the bootleg idea too. You know, who knows? I'll just put it this way: you never can tell. It is a very small world now, considering how powerful the internet is.
Right. Well, I'm sure if we had the bootleg version that got out, yeah, it would be all over the place. And if we were actually selling the bootleg version, we would be the ones getting sued. So.
Well, I'm not sure you'd get sued. I mean,
I just meant to watch it. I didn't want to sell it. I just wanted to see it.
I think at this point in the wrestling business, you know, I actually think it might do the wrestling business some good.
Yeah.
I mean, I really want to make a movie right now, you know, about the wrestling business. So we'll see what happens. Maybe I can find somebody to give me the backing to let me shoot my movie because I have written a script, and I've actually held on to my script because I do believe that in my own time
I'll have my own money and my own way to do it, and then that way I don't have to answer to anybody. I'll create my own movie and I'll release it, and we'll let it tell its own story. So
yeah,
we'll see what happens.
That's actually something Intra's brought up on the show. He's always wanted to see like a legit wrestling movie, not something that's making fun of wrestling, but
right.
something that's real, really about what goes on in wrestling.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to try and get somebody to buy in the wrestling business to get behind you, and Hollywood's not exactly embracing the wrestling business that way because so many people have such predisposed ideas about wrestling. I think, in fact, I remember talking to a guy one time about my script. He said to me, "What are you going to tell me about the wrestling business? That people do drugs, that people beat the shit out of each other? I already know that. Just because it's about the wrestling business doesn't mean it would sell." And, at that point when you're arguing with somebody like that, you go, yeah, whatever, see you later.
Right. No, it's kind of, no one thought, wrestling fans could read, and then Foley's book was a big hit.
Absolutely.
Or maybe they just bought it and didn't read it, I don't know.
Yeah, just to help Mick out, for God's sake, because God knows he's struggling.
Our other idea we said on the show, hope no one ever takes that, is we actually want to put out a pop-up book, because we believe wrestling fans.
That's awesome, man. That would be cool.
I got to bring up, because Brian brought this up earlier, and it was like something I think I mentioned to you the first time I talked to you was about the Johnny B. Bad Blaster.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, when you did it, you were actually worried, that it was going to hurt him.
Oh, I was scared shitless, dude. That was a gun. I don't care if it was full of pudding, man. It was still a gun. Mm-hmm. It was a CO2 fired gun with a cartridge in that son of a gun that, we rehearsed that so I wouldn't kill him because I was scared shitless, dude. I come from a gun family, and you don't point a gun at somebody, especially a loaded one,
Right.
It's a loaded gun. How much more needs to be said about it? So I was always just really afraid of that. In the end, I thought it turned out fantastic, and it was a blast, and it was actually one of the highlights of my life. And I'll be honest with you, it was a pleasure to work with Mark. Mark was absolutely a blast, and we had a great time through the whole thing. That whole incident turned out very well. Nobody lost an eye or got hurt really bad, didn't break an eardrum, because the potential was there, because that was genuinely a gun. And no matter how you look at it, it had a mass in there that could really hurt somebody. So I think we pulled it off and pulled it off well.
Do you think he got a bad rap in WWE? Because I always liked him in WCW as John B. Bad. And then when he went there, a lot of people said he couldn't wrestle.
Well, I think the other side of that is I would venture to say, because him and Sable were together, I don't know any of the detail, but I would say you're probably right, but I think a lot of that bad rap was probably behind the scenes, strictly because he, there was a lot of other things going on in his life at that time. I don't know a damn thing about it. Like I said, I'm just going to say nothing but nice things about Mark, because Mark and I got along great. We had some great matches, and honestly, I hit that guy in the head one time as hard as I could hit him. I told him to duck, and he didn't, and I hit him so freaking hard I broke my hand. Ooh. And he didn't go down. And for a 350-pound man to hit you in the head as hard as he can, and you not go down, you're a tough son of a bitch in my book. I don't care who you are.
Oh, definitely. Someone in our chat room asked earlier if you ever thought about going to ECW.
You mean now?
No, not now, but not the new ECW, but when ECW was around in '94.
I actually talked to Jim for a minute. And, the truth of the matter is, for me, you guys, I was done with the wrestling business, man. The steam had gone completely out of me. The wind was out of my sail, and I was, like I said, when you have children, I watched so many of my friends lose their families in the wrestling business, and I couldn't do that to my kids. I loved my children more than anything on this planet, and I could not be their father. So I made a conscious decision to stay home, and it was hard. I got to tell you, anybody who's been a wrestler, I went through the worst. You couldn't compare heroin or cocaine withdrawals to it. No how, no way. It was the hardest thing I've done, because when you're addicted to the pop, when you're addicted to fans cheering and addicted to the rush of being a star, it's really tough to give that up. But I don't regret a second of it, because my family meant more to me than anything. And I stuck it out, and I raised all my kids till they were grown adults and moved out of my house. And I don't regret that. So, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, you make a conscious decision to do something like that. And so it wasn't really that hard of a decision for me to not go back into it, because I could have gone on, man. I really could. If I'd have pursued it and pushed it at all, I could have gone back into the wrestling business despite my shit with knobs and stags. But the truth of the matter is, I didn't push it because I didn't want to.
Mm-hmm. I gotta say, your suplex on knobs is one of the highest viewed videos, I think, on YouTube.
Is it really?
I think so.
That's cool, man.
Yeah, when he bends right in half.
Son of a bitch deserved it, and I'd do it again to the son of a bitch if he was anywhere close enough I could grab him.
We got one last caller here. We got Jai on the line.
Go ahead.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
How you doing? Have you ever thought of training wrestlers today?
You know, I would like to say, you know, I actually did. I had a training school for a while in the early 90s. But the truth of the matter is, for me, I'm so removed from the wrestling business right now that just isn't even a thought for me. I'm sure I could make good money at it. I'm sure I could open a wrestling school and make good money. But the thought of getting in the ring again, the thought of taking bumps and doing that just defies what I am right now and where I'm at in my life. So the honest answer to that is no.
And I have one more question.
Go ahead.
You said that you're in the movie business too. How come they never made a movie like you know, they make the Muhammad Ali story, but how come they never do that with any of the wrestlers? Like,
well, because I think that's an easy question to answer. I mean, Muhammad Ali is viewed as legit, isn't he? The wrestling business is considered fake. So if it's considered fake, what could anybody possibly see value in making a movie about a business that's considered fake, even though it's a billion-dollar industry? How the hell can anybody want to see a movie about the wrestling business when it's not real? And what people don't understand about the wrestling business is that it is real. Regardless of what you think happens in the ring, the people that do it are real. The people that do it get hurt. The people that do it devote their lives to the business. The people that do it have sacrificed their families, their, you know, everything to be in the business. And I've seen a lot of dudes who lost everything to be a part of the wrestling business. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there will be a great movie out there someday about the wrestling business, and quite frankly, I'd like to be the guy to do it because I have no affiliatory ties to the wrestling business, and maybe it will take somebody who's been blackballed in the wrestling business to make a movie about it so that he has no ramifications and no fear of ever going back to it. I have no fear of ever going back to the wrestling business. I don't care if I ever make a dime in it, so that's always been my life goal. I want to make a movie about the wrestling business. If I could just find the right investor, I'd do it. I'd start tomorrow, and I have all the connections to make it happen. So anybody out there listening that's got $10 million that wants to make a wrestling movie, give me a call, and we'll make it tomorrow.
Sure.
I thought the Fox family would be a great subject.
10 million's a bit steep for myself.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, thanks for calling in, Jack.
Jack, I'll call back when you guys talk about Raw.
All right. Thanks, man.
Bye.
Actually, we do have one more caller here. We probably should let Max go here. It's been about 2 hours. James, you got a question quick?
Hey, Max. I wanted to say I had the pleasure of seeing you live in person here in Illinois a couple years back.
Oh, man, that's cool.
I wanted to, well, actually, a couple of the questions we don't have time for. I was just going to ask, I guess, what is some of your favorite rock bands?
Well, first and foremost, I got to give props to my major, and I said it earlier. The two bands that influenced me the most, uncategorically, no doubt about it, Alice Cooper, #1, Black Sabbath, #2. So they had a huge impact on my life. I love the fact that they were so different than anything that was out. I grew up in the early 70s, and I wasn't a huge fan of Led Zeppelin because it was just, it wasn't dark enough for me. It wasn't powerful enough. And Zeppelin and Cooper, they just added a darkness that nobody else brought to the table. They were very unique. And so Cooper and Sabbath were absolutely my biggest influences. The bands I listen to today, I love Linkin Park. I love Seven Dust. I love, lots of different. I still listen to tons of metal. Believe it or not, I love Nickelback. I think they're a great heavy metal band. I listen to a lot of heavy stuff, like bands like
oh gosh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I hate that one. Brain fart. Oh gosh, I know the name of the album. Reroute to Remain is my favorite. In Flames. I like In Flames.
Oh yeah.
I like, you know, I like a lot of that kind of stuff. Anything really heavy. I like heavy melodic stuff. So that's what I'd have to say is my big favorites.
All right, sounds good, man. Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Thanks for calling in, James. Did it ever piss you off when wrestlers who could play guitar had him as their gimmick?
Oh, absolutely. Van Hammer was a classic example of that. I remember sitting in the dressing room playing my guitar the first time in front of Van Hammer. I thought he was going to cry. Honest to God, dude, man, he was so pissed. In fact, my son still has his Flying V. He dropped it off the back of his motorcycle, and I bought it from him. In fact, he gave it to me because he busted the hell out of it. And I took it and fixed it, and my son still plays it today.
Yeah, he used to come on just swinging around his neck. Oh, God.
Yeah.
Van Hammer.
Yeah. You know, it was. I always liked the fact that I was legit. Unfortunately, in the wrestling business, if you're legit, you're a freak. Nobody's going to believe that you're legit. So that was always the problem for me. If you're legit in the wrestling business, they don't know what the hell to do with you, you know?
I actually always thought it did add to Honky Tonk Man that he couldn't play the guitar because it made him, like, even more of a heel.
Yeah, and Honky Tonk Man hated me, man, because I could play. One time I sat in a dressing room and played in front of him. I thought he was going to have me escorted out by the freaking security guy.
Well, we want to thank you for coming on tonight. Really appreciate it. We had you for almost 2 hours, so we probably shouldn't keep you much longer.
Man, I appreciate it. It was a blast, you guys. You call me back anytime you want me to come back on your show. I'd love to.
All right, thanks a lot.
This is Mick Foley, the Hardcore Legend, and this is InYourHeadOnline.com.